It was winter in Conche, and Ned Dower was looking through the window at the schooner Elsie. He owned the ship with his brother John. She wasn't a big boat, but the Elsie was profitable, and between the cod fishery and the seal hunt, the men could feed their growing families and manage to offer work to a good number of locals from Conche, too. Winter was a slow season for the Dowers. The Elsie had been tied to the wharf since late fall, and by the end of February, Ned was itching to set sail again. Thankfully, it would soon be time for seals. Ned wanted to be able to head to the ice floes the minute the conditions were right. To that end, he hauled out his old sea chest and began filling it with the things he might want for the voyage. If he hadn't been in such a rush, he might have noticed a small box in the bottom corner of the chest. The box held an assortment of important papers. Among them were the deeds he and his wife needed to guarantee their financial well-being. The box didn't really belong in the sea chest. He had stashed it there for safekeeping after reviewing the papers, and he'd forgotten about it. He had no intention of taking it to sea with him. The papers would be safer on dry land. If he'd seen it there, he'd have given it to Ellen to stow away, but in his rush he missed it, and soon it was tucked away under his blankets and clothes. On March 1st, the conditions were perfect for seals. The Elsie left Conche with Ned at the helm, and a misplaced box of important papers in the chest under his bunk. By March 17th, the Elsie was in the fat, the seals were plentiful, and for the next week the men worked hard, pausing long enough only to sleep. Things couldn't be going better. Back at home, it was a different story. Everyone knew Ellen Dower as a capable woman. If Ned was skipper of the Elsie, Ellen was captain at home. She took care of the business affairs on land while Ned was at sea. She'd grown used to Ned's voyages, but she didn't like them. His life was a dangerous one, and she was never quite at ease when he was gone. She was always half afraid something bad would happen to him. When she was worried about Ned, she found herself worrying about other things that wouldn't normally bother her. Shortly after Ned left, she found herself thinking about their financial affairs. She wanted to review the papers, to set her mind at ease, but she couldn't find their little document box anywhere. She knew if it wasn't in the house, it must be aboard the Elsie, but it wasn't like Ned to take it, especially without telling her. She tried to put it out of her mind, but it worried her. What if Ned didn't have the papers? What if they were lost? By March 25th, the worry had taken its toll. She was exhausted. Early in the evening, she retired to her favorite chair. Over the last week, her daughter had been reading a story aloud. She was looking forward to hearing more of it, but, despite her interest, it wasn't long before Ellen's head nodded. Noticing her mother was asleep and missing the story, Ellen's daughter put the book down and spoke. There was no response. She walked over to her mother and spoke again. Still nothing. Whatever she tried, she couldn't rouse her mother. Frightened, she ran to the neighbor's house for help. They applied every remedy they could think of, but still Ellen was frozen in place. Worse yet, she seemed to be deteriorating. With each passing minute, her arms and legs felt colder and the color drained from her skin. They wrapped her with blankets, but it was no good. Soon her breathing slowed, and then no one could find a heartbeat. Ellen Dower was dead. Back aboard the Elsie, Ned knew the crew needed a break. The hunt had been going well, and everyone was exhausted. He instructed them to take the evening off and to get some rest. The sun had barely set when most of the men were asleep. Ned retired to his quarters too. As he lay on his bunk, he thought, if the sealing continued at this pace, he'd be back in Conche in a matter of days. Just as he began to doze, he heard something. It sounded like a rustling on the stairs. If he didn't know better, he'd think it was Ellen. It sounded for all the world like the noise Ellen's dress made as she hurried about the house. He could almost smell her perfume. What could be making that sound? He sat up, and before his feet hit the floor, he felt like his heart stopped. It was Ellen. She was in his room aboard the Elsie. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. Ellen was in Conche, some 70 miles of sea ice and ocean away. He couldn't speak, and even if he could, what would he say? In all their years of marriage, he'd never seen her look so miserable, so tortured. She seemed determined, as if consumed by a single purpose. It was as if Ned weren't even there. She pulled the wooden chest from under his bunk and began searching through it. One by one, all the articles came out. She stacked them neatly beside her on the floor. Then she found the document box. She opened it and unfolded the papers inside. She quickly glanced through the documents and returned them to the box. She put the box back in its place and repacked the chest. She pushed the chest back under the bunk, left Ned's room, and disappeared from the Elsie. Ned was heartbroken. Even through his shock, he knew this could only mean one thing. He'd heard talk of tokens, apparitions of loved ones appearing to their families as they were dying, but he hadn't believed in them, not till now. But what else could it have been? A dream? He pulled out the chest from under the bed and rifled through it. There, just where Ellen had found it, was the document box. He had no idea he'd brought it with him. He couldn't have dreamed it. Ellen had been there. Miles from home, Ned began to come to terms with the news fast spreading through Conche. His wife was dead. Ned told the crew what he had seen. They tried to convince him that everything might be okay, but they quietly agreed there was little hope for Ellen Dower. The small crew joined their hands in a prayer and decided to make for Conche as quickly as the ice and wind would allow. If they could do one last thing for Mrs. Dower, they vowed, it would be to deliver her husband in time for the funeral. Back at the Dower house, people were stunned. How could Ellen Dower have died? Mere hours ago she'd seemed healthy enough. It didn't make sense. Sense or not, there were plans to be made, and in the kitchen there was talk of a wake. In the inside room, Ellen's daughter crouched next to her mother, whose body was still reclined in her favorite chair. She held her mother's cold, motionless hand. Then, suddenly, there was a noise. It was like a gentle cough. Hopefully, she scanned her mother's face. It didn't seem as pale. Could it be? Yes, Ellen was breathing again. As if waking from a deep sleep, Ellen slowly opened her eyes. Her lips trembled. "I've been so far from here," she whispered. "I walked through the ice and climbed over rocks. I passed gray islands, and I found her. The Elsie was so far away, but I found her. Ned has the papers. Everything's fine," she sighed. With that, Ellen drifted into a heavy sleep. Back on the Elsie, it was as if their prayers were answered. The ice cleared the next morning, and the crew set a course for Conche, where they were sure they'd find Mrs. Ellen Dower dead. It was going to be a sad homecoming. Usually when the Elsie returned from the front, it was with full colors. They'd hoist their flags in celebration of a prosperous hunt and joyful homecoming. But there was no joy aboard the Elsie, so no flags were raised. As Conche came into view, they looked for some sign, something to reassure them that the skipper's encounter had been wrong and Mrs. Dower was still well. They saw nothing to confirm nor deny their fears. As they were scanning the shoreline, the people of Conche were looking toward the Elsie. There were no flags, and that meant one thing. It was a ship in mourning. Someone on board must be dead, they thought. When the Elsie tied to the wharf, the grieving crew was met with a sea of worried faces, each group afraid to have their fears confirmed. Much to their relief, they soon sorted out the confusion. It was the best news possible. Everyone was well. Ellen Dower was alive, and there'd been no death on the Elsie. They were happy, of course. But as the story came into focus, there was a sense of unease. What strange event had unfolded around them? Talk of tokens was one thing, but this was something beyond understanding. Had Ellen Dower left her body behind? Had she traveled miles across the frozen ocean to her husband's schooner to ease her troubled mind? The two halves of the story, one told on shore and the other recounted far out at sea, fit together perfectly. It didn't make much sense, but there was little choice but to believe it.